Sergei was forced to become a conductor, not by a lack of money at all, but by the necessity caused by a series of accidents on the long-distance Moscow-Vladivostok train. Statistics spoke for themselves. For the last 6 months, in the cars of this train, at least 35 people died. One should not think that all of them became victims of murderers. No, 90% of the dead died of cardiac arrest caused by a strong nervous shock. At first, no one paid serious attention to these deaths, considering them only unpleasant, but no reason for panic. Moreover, no criminal element was found in the deaths of the deceased. However, when people started dying almost every week, the management of the N-City Railroad began to be wary of this high passenger mortality rate. They noticed that most of the deaths occurred on the section between Luchegorsk station and the final destination in Vladivostok. It was along these 480 kilometers that most of the deaths occurred. People most often died in the vestibule or while going to the restroom. No one could understand what was happening to these people, who, after a few minutes, died under inexplicable circumstances. A perfectly healthy and normal person would walk into the vestibule, and then his heart would fail. All this looked, to put it mildly, strange, and for this reason, the railroad management decided to introduce a man from the officer staff into the train. The choice fell on a young man named Sergei. He was chosen for one simple reason. His appearance was ordinary, unremarkable, and did not arouse suspicion. No one meeting Sergei for the first time would have thought that he was a police officer with experience arresting dangerous criminals. Lieutenant, Sergei thought, looking out at the world through the thick lenses of his fake glasses, which he wore to reassure potential targets of surveillance. Interesting role. The assignment Sergei received was quite delicate. In the confined space of the railcar, where there were no suspects, it wasn't clear who he should follow or who he should apprehend. Sergei realized that refusing to perform this task would probably be regarded as cowardice, so he decided to take a risky action, not even knowing what it might entail. Agreeing to conduct a secret operation, Sergei set only one condition: to study the autopsy reports on the bodies of those who died during the trip. As it turned out, this request was not empty, and the operative managed to discover something exciting. The autopsies of the stomachs of the deceased revealed, in addition to the remains of food, olive pips. The presence of this object in itself seemed strange, especially considering the absence of dishes with olives in the train's restaurant. Sergei would have gladly believed it to be a coincidence if it weren't for the find: 30 pips collected in a glass jar. Normally, there should have been many more, but in the initial stages of the autopsy, it was simply not carried out. However, that's not all. For some unknown reason, the victim's internal organs, including the heart, esophagus, and intestines, were frozen to ice. At the same time, the limbs remained soft and were not frozen. It seemed that the deceased were simply frozen under the influence of liquid nitrogen and snacked on olive pips before they died. Sergei never managed to learn more, as he had no time to prepare. Nevertheless, he made a decision and set off on his first trip as a guide. This route, which was over 9,000 kilometers long, was to be completed in a little over 6 days. During this time, Sergei intended to figure out what was going on in the train and solve the mystery of the strange deaths. Sergei, who had recently become a conductor, first got to know the other employees, as they, thanks to their work, could see or hear something on the day of the mysterious deaths. However, they all said the same thing: "I don't know, I didn't see, I didn't hear." Sergei understood that they were frightened. However, 35 corpses in 6 months were quite capable of causing a belief in poltergeists, especially since strange things were happening very rapidly. Complicated situation, Sergei thought as he walked through the train, trying to spot anything unusual. He personally went around every carriage, trying to find some traces or clues, but everything was in vain. The only thing he managed to find out was that all the passengers died after stopping at the Luchagorsk station. He studied the map and realized that this station was like any other. There was nothing special about it. Sergei thought he might have missed something. The list of casualties was causing him confusion. It turned out that there was even one conductor among the dead. He had died before everyone else, but his superiors had immediately organized a funeral at their own expense to avoid publicity. In addition to the conductor, several people died who were not connected by anything except their presence in the car at that moment. Sergei was puzzled. By what criteria does the killer choose? And assuming he exists, of course. This riddle tormented the policeman almost halfway through the journey, after which he abandoned his scheme. The lieutenant's heart began to race at the mere thought that in a couple of days the Luchagorsk station, where it all began, would appear. He was nervous, looking out the window and watching the monotonous scenery of fields and forests that took up most of the visible picture. Listening to the sounds of the train, Sergei imagined what might happen in the near future. After several hours, the train finally slowed down, preparing to stop. Anxiety was growing inside Sergei. He was already full of confidence that something would happen at Luchagorsk station, and if it didn't, he would get off the train in Vladivostok and fly back by airplane. The closer they got to the desired station, the tenser his heart became. Finally, the train began to slow down to a smooth stop. Then everything came to a standstill. Well, here we go, Sergei thought, and quietly, step by step, he began to move from car to car to assess the situation in each one. He did not know what he was looking for, so he paid close attention to everything unusual. Suspicious faces, unusual objects. All this could be a clue. In one carriage, Sergei noticed a grandmother who looked like the old woman Shapokliak from the cartoon about Wait, but he is not interested in her ticket. But in the other car ran a string of passengers. Sergei looked closely and realized that among them there was no one who could arouse suspicion. Although it was not quite so. One girl, about 18 years old, dressed in a winter coat and low-heeled boots, caught the lieutenant's eye. Her outfit of a warm coat and boots in the middle of May seemed extremely strange to Sergei. She stood out among the others as if she had nothing else to wear. Maybe it's a local fashion, Sergei thought, but here was her look, cold, as if she were looking at the world through the eyes of a hooligan who was thinking of setting fire to an anthill. Deciding to improvise, Sergei blocked the girl's way and, trying not to give away his suspicion, asked, "Show me, please, your ticket, citizen." The girl looked at him with her colorless, almost fishy eyes and muttered something vague, holding out a crumpled piece of paper. Sergei took it in his hand and almost recoiled. This ticket of hers seemed to him so cold. as if it belonged to a person who was not alive. But he invited her inside the carriage, and he slowly followed her. The girl walked as if mesmerized, so that it seemed that she did not even touch the floor with her boots. Sergei's suspicions increased when they entered a half-lit vestibule where a man of about 45 was smoking. Sergei could see perfectly well what was going on through the vestibule window, allowing him to keep an eye on the strange passenger. And at the end of the train, something unexpected happened. The girl abruptly piled on the man, as if she had collided with him, and her whole body, at first glance, blocked the passage. But in fact, it was quite different. The man suddenly turned pale, grabbed his stomach, and fell to the floor. The girl took something out of her pocket and forcefully pushed it into the man's mouth, who was in extreme pain. Sergei realized that something irreparable had happened. He tore the door of the vestibule open and felt the coldness coming from the stranger on his skin. The air seemed to crunch on his teeth from the microparticles of ice frozen in it. Sergei's hand reached for his gun, and his eyes looked at what had entered the carriage in the guise of a girl. Before Sergei stood some entity that embodied an inhuman coldness. This clot of negative energy emitted so much cold that Sergei's lips were instantly covered with frost. The creature in the guise of a girl came even closer, depriving the lieutenant of the opportunity to draw his pistol. The train slowly picked up speed, but no one in the car was even aware of what was going on in the vestibule. Sergei realized that he still had a minute left before his body was completely frozen. Already, all his muscles were stiff from the cold, and his tendons were stretched like guitar strings. The distortion on the maiden's face showed that she was experiencing incredible pleasure, though her face was marred by cramps and deep wounds. Sergei's jaws clenched like a snare, and his eyes could have turned into 2 frozen pigeon eggs at any moment. The icy creature came closer and closer. Sergei's insides literally stood on fire. At that moment, the door of the vestibule opened, and the profile of an unsuspecting smoker appeared in the doorway. The damned creature let his guard down for a moment, and that gave Sergei the opportunity to gather his will in a fist and grab his gun. The shot rang out almost immediately. It was due to Sergei's limited movement as his finger penetrated the frost fence and pressed the trigger. The bullet struck the creature in the lower jaw, crushing the back of its head as it exited. The icy crumb of frozen particles shook and clung to Sergei's hand with a dead grip, freezing his hand with monstrous force. Sergei screamed in pain, but there was nothing he could do. Sergei's hand instantly froze to the bone, and from the crunch of ice, it burst near the forearm. The creature fell to the floor, clutching the fingers of Sergei's hand, atrophied by the cold. Sergei could barely remember the next event. He slowly settled down on the floor, and when he opened his eyes, he saw Major Rykov, the head of the investigation department, in front of him. "What was that?" Sergei asked. The major grudgingly wrinkled his nose and told her what he had managed to find out about the stranger. Her name was Tatiana Egorova. She was a heavy drinker. Her mother was ill, and she lived wherever she could. She traveled around the country looking for a living. A year ago, she boarded a train at Luchegorsk station without a ticket when it was freezing cold. More than 30 people, as luck would have it, boarded there as well. Frost and blizzard spread their dominion, covering everything around them with a snow-white veil. Tatiana walked, wrapped in a winter coat, but not a down jacket, and although it helped keep her warm, she was still freezing. She covered a path more than 10 kilometers long, but eventually collapsed without strength and could no longer get up. In her purse, she carried the same glass jar of olives she had bought for her mother. She wanted to get home, but she didn't have time. Tatiana was found only when the snow melted and her dead body literally rang from the cold. After that, the horrible deaths began. First, the conductor who put Tatiana on the train died, and then all the others. Sergei swallowed the lump in his throat with difficulty and asked the question, "And why were they killed?" Rykov, scratching the back of his head, replied with some derision, most likely for nothing. When she was thrown off the train, not a single passenger stood up for her. They could have helped, fought her off, and let her ride for free. Perhaps it was something that changed her and gave her the power of a distant world. She rose from the dead and gained power from beyond. So she killed until the olives in the jar ran out. They say there were about a dozen of them. The major's words echoed grimly in the air, and Sergei could not hold back the tears that came to his eyes. He had never felt so heavy at heart. Perhaps it was the price of victory, his victory over himself, a dead woman revived in the guise of an ice witch.